Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Spotlight Talk. My name is Katie Nguyen. I'm the Communications and Public Programs Director. I'm just going to give a moment for the last few people to trickle in. But thank you so much for joining us. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started because it's just a 20-minute talk that we do for these Spotlight Talks. We kind of dive into one particular object or aspect of Esherick's work, and we don't want to waste any time because I think today is really going to be a wonderful conversation. I'll pass it over to my colleague here in a moment, but before I do that, for any of you that haven't been to one of these before, I'll just mention that if you can keep yourself on mute during the program, that would be great, just so that we can go through and hear all of Holly's wonderful information together. And then if you do have questions or comments or things that you're curious about, you can type those into the chat as the program is happening, and we can take a look at them at the end. Or if you prefer, at the end of the program, you can unmute yourself and chime in and just ask your question out loud. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Holly Gore.
Great, thanks so much, Katie. So again, I'm Holly Gore. I am the Director of Interpretation and Research here at the Wharton Esherick Museum, and I am so pleased to invite you, to welcome you to our October Spotlight Talk today. And so I'm just going to go ahead and jump in right away and share my screen. Good. Okay. So today we're going to be shining light on Wharton Esherick's architecture of the 1960s. And this was an era when he was kind of dreaming about these kind of soft flowing forms that he was realizing in hard concrete, and at the same time laying foundations for preserving his legacy. So today's program is part of the Wharton Esherick Museum's 50th anniversary celebration. The museum first opened to the public in 1972, and that was about 2 years after Wharton Esherick passed at 82 years old in 1970. The museum founders were all his family members, and they were really united with this vision that they needed to keep the studio intact with all of its artworks, holding together this kind of total work of art that we celebrate today. The story that the museum archives tell us about the museum building was that it actually began during Wharton Esherick's lifetime, during the 1960s, and also with his knowledge and cooperation. So 1967 was kind of a landmark year for the museum getting started. That was the year that Wharton Esherick's daughter Ruth and her husband Bob Bascom bought their father's property, which included several buildings, including the Esherick Studio that I'm showing here, the kind of centerpiece of the museum that they would begin. So in effect, they took over his mortgage and his debt. They did this to help him financially. And also they explicitly said that this was with the idea that the museum would one day become, or that the studio would become a museum. After Wharton Esherick died, Ruth and Bob moved to the property, and they converted a workshop building that was near the studio into their home. 1967 was also the year that Wharton Esherick's longtime partner, Miriam Phillips, moved to the studio. She moved there, she cared for him, and then she actually stayed on for 2 decades after his death, living there as the museum's first curator. And so the time and place when these kind of plans for the museum started to gel are the kind of setting for today's talk. And one of the architectural projects that I'm going to talk about will be the concrete addition that Wharton made to the studio. He called it his silo, and it's shown here in the photo, just kind of beautifully catching the light with its painted surfaces. But the first thing I'm going to begin with is a slightly earlier architectural project, which used similar forms and construction. So the Michael Watson House I'm showing here was the only Wharton Esherick's only ever commission to design an entire home. It's located in Pittsford, New York, near Rochester, and has extensive use of concrete block and stucco to create these kind of soft, fluid, flowing, organic forms that we see throughout. So I'll talk a little bit about the history of the project while we look at this kind of early floor plan. So Morton Esherick met Michael Watson around 1961. He was introduced by Franz Wildenhain, the noted ceramist, who was a great friend of Esherick's and also a neighbor of Watson's. So Michael Watson was an MD. He was a third generation patron of the arts, an amateur woodworker, and a huge admirer of Esherick. Watson was planning to build a new home, and he thought it would be great if Morton Esherick could do a stairway and a fireplace for it. But as the two men got to know each other a little better, the plans kind of grew in complexity until we arrived at what we're looking at here, which is a blueprint for an entire Esherick built home that is filled with Esherick furniture. So kind of a total environment. And I'll just walk through a little bit of what we're seeing here on these plans. So this is for a 2-story, 5-bedroom house. I don't know if you can read the writing on here, but this large shape is the ground level. And then this is kind of a smaller 2nd story. And the way I like to match these up is with the staircase. So this is the staircase here on the upper level. And then here it is on the bottom floor. So those kind of sit right on top of each other. This kind of blank spot here is a 3-car garage. And then all of the other rooms are filled with furniture. And if anyone who's familiar with Morton Esherick's furniture designs of the 1960s can probably recognize a lot of these contours, these kind of curved sofas, amoeba tables, kind of soft curving countertops, these kind of flowing forms that would have been, you know, on all of the artworks. So the interior was never actually realized in this way, and I'm not sure exactly how that came to pass, but there was a major dispute that broke out during the project that meant that Morton Esherick and Watson were no longer friends, and in fact Morton would actually leave the project before the house, even the shell of the house was ever built. So one point of contention was Esherick's fee as a designer, how much he was going to get paid for his part. So in typical Morton Esherick fashion, he did not quote Michael Watson a price at the outset. He just said he had no way of knowing the cost. He'd never done anything like this before, and he trusted Michael Watson to pay him fairly. And this really makes a lot of sense because this was a very unusual kind of terms. No one would have really been very familiar with this arrangement because Watson had actually engaged Esherick to work as an artist and could create this kind of sculptural building. Esherick would be the creative lead, working with an architect that Watson had hired and who would play a technical role. So the architect would have the job of realizing these kinds of forms that Morton Esherick was dreaming up. Morton Esherick was not trained as an architect, so he would have relied on others to engineer his forms, to produce blueprints, or even to create a kind of rendering like the one we're looking at here. This would have been done by someone in that architecture office. It was 2 years into the project when Esherick submitted a bill and stating the amount he wanted to receive, which Watson disputed by quite a lot. A second point of contention had to do with the staircase. So Michael Watson was enamored with Morton Esherick's staircase that was in his studio, which I'm showing in the larger of these 2 photos here. And Morton Esherick agreed to build him a version of it, meaning it would not be identical. It would be kind of based on that. He didn't really like to make 2 things that were identical. He found that a little bit boring. And then the smaller of these images shows the model of the Watson staircase, which has really the same basic format, but it had much smoother lines and kind of a sleeker feel. So some of the disagreements around this had to do with the cost. Again, once Morton Esherick had this mostly built, they had a disagreement over how much he should get paid. The design, Watson threatened to reject it, and because he said it wasn't picking up on the aspects of Morton's staircase that he wanted, or I don't know, maybe he just didn't want to pay for it, I'm not sure. And there was also an added headache, was a mix up with the ceiling dimensions that made it a little too short. Actually, one of Morton Esherick's clients likened it to when you buy a suit and the trousers are a little too short. So through all of these negotiations, there was a lot of back and forth. There were letters, phone calls, trips back and forth from New York to Pennsylvania. It was a tense situation, and it was really on the brink of litigation, and it must have been very stressful. And so here we have from Wharton Esherick, a kind of from his papers, a kind of note where he jotted down some of his feelings. And I'm just going to read a little bit of it. He says, "To Michael, you have no idea what you are doing. You imagine everybody has money and you lord your demands over them. I have no money, but a talent, which I am generous enough to share with you." So, to me, given the climate, which was pretty tense, this was probably not a letter that he ever would have intended to send, but probably more of a note jotted down in a moment of frustration, maybe after a phone call with Watson or maybe with one of the lawyers. But the situation wasn't entirely dire. Wharton Esherick actually had some very good help in getting through it. And the person who was going to help him resolve the impasse with Watson was Bob Bascom. And this was his son-in-law, who I mentioned earlier, who with his wife, Ruth, would buy Wharton Esherick's property, assuming the mortgage and debt. So Bob was himself an architect and had a lot of project management experience. So he would have been really well positioned to broker a resolution, which he did. And the image I'm showing here is a note that Wharton wrote to Bob after what was evidently a successful meeting with Michael Watson. So Wharton says, "Bob, that speech you pulled off on Watson, 2 minutes chatter and $500 was moved out of that tight guy. What an orator, what a helper. Thanks, I'm having it with you. Enclosed $250, Wharton." So just a little bit of history of Wharton and Bob. They first met in 1960. So at this point, they would have known each other for a few years. And throughout the 1960s, Bob would play an increasingly important role in managing his father-in-law's business. The Watson project, so there was kind of like just one of several events kind of trust building trust between Wharton Esherick and the person to whom he would eventually turn over the keys to his castle. And by that, I mean the studio. And here, just very quickly, are Ruth and Bob 20 years after they assumed the mortgage and had paid it off, and they're doing a kind of ritual burning of the document in actually what is a very early Wharton Esherick concrete design, the fireplace in his 1956 workshop. So back to the silo, the studio. So Esherick built the silo addition onto the studio just right on the heels of the Watson project from 1965 to 66, with the years that he worked on the silo. And I see a lot of similar forms. And I guess the story I tell myself is that like maybe he got to have, something for himself that was good out of that kind of not so great experience, kind of using those designs and that technical know-how that he would have gotten from working with those architects to build himself something the way he wanted it. And for me, looking at the silo, it's just so integral to this iconic building, and just these lines that I can't imagine the building without it. But in fact, Wharton Esherick only lived with the silo for about 3 years. So I'm just point out the door, the front door, that kind of blue door in the photo that's nested up near the silo. And then here, if we kind of go back in time, is the same door with nothing but space and views behind it. So Esherick is in this photo. This is from about 1960. So he's in the photo. He is the person on the bench who is seated and who is not wearing sunglasses. And standing beside him is Miriam, his life partner, who I mentioned earlier would move into the studio within a few years of this photo being taken, and would live there through the 1990s as the first curator. And the silo addition would ultimately provide her with an area of personal space to live in that was set apart from what would become the public areas of the museum. So here's a little before and after to show the ways in which the silo expansion created new spaces within the studio. So if you look at the after photo from 1966, there's a lot of new wood on the building. And the reason for that is that in addition to building the silo, Wharton Esherick added a second story to an existing vestibule and just kind of re-sided the entire thing. So I'll show this here with the little red pointer again. here is the vestibule. Here in this open space is where he would extend. And so this space here inside of this second story of the wood building was something that he was using as a guest room. And so this new space over the vestibule would become a bath. And then within the silo, there was an upper floor, kind of a dressing room with extensive closets, and then a kitchen below, the first kind of modern kitchen that the studio would have. And here are just a couple of details showing some of those really sculptural forms. Like the Watson House, this was created with concrete block covered with stucco. The patches of color are pigment that were brushed into the last layer of stucco when it was still wet, so it's kind of a fresco. And those who visited the studio already will recognize the kitchen very well. An area of the silo that we don't show on the public tours is the dressing room above it. The access is a little bit tricky up a very steep staircase, and it's also right now being used for storage. That's why I don't have any recent photos of it, but I did get some photos of the upstairs bathroom, which is also something we don't see on the tours. You can see some of those organic curves, a kind of a olive green pigment that's mixed into the stucco, giving it this kind of glowing coloration. It kind of changes with the light. It's interesting, this is the only tub in the studio. Morton always had a shower, he had a very basic shower, just drained right through the floor. And it's really the only room having a lot of these off-the-shelf fixtures that coordinate kind of this tan sink, tan tub, and you can't see it, but there's also a matching toilet. And here, just to give another kind of angle on those curves, you can see the curves around the ceiling in this one. The mirror that's on the bathroom door is kind of an interesting shape, like really flared up at the top. And it's a little hard to see, but there's an inscription carved right above the glass that says, "This will help." And when I read this, I feel like I'm seeing one side of a private conversation. I'm like, help with what? And I just feel like a lot about this room in general feels very private. Like there was a private conversation, between him and Miriam, like, these were ultimately her spaces. And, so I wonder things like, to what extent did he create this mini apartment for her? Did he plan this as her kind of mini apartment? Was the green a color that she liked? Was the tan a color that she liked? Is the tub there because that was her preference? I mean, I don't think we'll ever really know. But I can't help but wonder, was Esherick doing this really as a conscious way of creating the infrastructure to preserve his legacy? So I'll end with a photo of the silo that I took just 2 days ago. It shows it starting its yearly act of camouflaging with the fall foliage around. Kind of a dreamy nod to the seasonal change in a kind of concrete stucco and paint. So that's what I have for today. So I will stop sharing my screen and we'll open up to conversation. Any thoughts?
Holly, you said that he added the color when the cement was wet. I've been saying in the tours that it's colored pigment in the cement, which is what I thought. It was powdered pigment mixed in. Could you clarify that a little bit?
So they would have put, so like a fresco, they would have done an area of the plain stucco on there, and then they would have brushed in the pigment. It probably was not powdered pigment. It was probably wetted with a little bit of water or some kind of binder to allow it to be on a brush. And the one person the one eyewitness account we have of this was from Miriam, who saw this going on. And she said, that Wharton, of course, he was, in his 80s at that point, was not climbing ladders. And so there was actually someone up there with a brush, kind of brushing it in, and he would say, left, right, up, down kind of thing.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I understood from Bob Bascom that Wharton did do the lower part, but then gave in to the ladders, but he did have a hand in doing that silo.
Yeah.
And Bob said he was very directive with, he said more red. He was very directive with the colors and so forth.
Yeah. Rob, what else? Did Bob tell you anything else about the silo production? I feel like that's one part of the studio that we have like a lot fewer stories about. It just, there's much less information on that.
Yeah, that's about all. Just told me about the logistics of, putting it together. But I appreciate your insights into the Watson house and the correspondence. And the letter he wrote to Bob just reinforces how powerful that relationship was. There was mutual affection and respect between the two men.
Bob would have been an incredible help in this, because I was going through, I mean, the file on the Watson house is extensive, and it looks like Michael Watson was actually trying to kind of use he was using the fact that Wharton Esherick was a designer against him. So Wharton Esherick was, an artist conceiving the but not working in the usual way of an interior designer. But Michael Watson said, well, the designer usually gets this percentage of the architect's fee. But of course, Wharton Esherick conceived the whole house. It was a very different kind of designer. So he was kind of using the fact that Esherick was not an architect and not really versed in that against him. And so Bob would have been able to step in pretty quickly as an architect who'd done a lot of construction supervision and to, straighten a lot of that out. And, call them on that.
And regarding the mirror, Bob said to me that apparently Miriam did say to Wharton, I do need a mirror in that bathroom. So there was indeed a conversation.
Yeah.
He very concretely answered her question.
Funny. Yeah.
Holly, I do see a question in the chat from Chuck. He says, if it was concrete block under, how did they achieve the curved form? I don't know if you have any insight or anything to offer in terms of that aspect of the construction.
Yeah, I actually don't know. I've seen the documentation on the Watson house that they talked about using those materials and creating the curves. I don't technically know enough about concrete to answer that.
It was definitely insightful for me to think about, like you were saying, how much, at least getting into the beginnings of the Watson house and being involved with the architects to some extent there may have given him some of the knowledge to go and do it on his own. And I also wondered how much it's similar to the Con workshop and how that's constructed.
Yeah, so the Con workshop, which I didn't speak about, was a 1950s building. It's just steps away from the studio, and it is built with concrete block with stucco applied over it. And of course, Wharton Esherick very famously went around the job site and realized that he could make the walls curved. So there was a foundation that was a certain width, but then the blocks were a little narrower. And so he realized, oh, there's room to make a curve. So, walking around on the job site, in the moment, making those changes, he got that little bit of a curve. And I think with the Watson house and his own silo, really, because he was not collaborating, went, full Wharton Esherick with all of the kind of organic forms that he loved so much in that era.
Chuck has a follow-up question here. Are there photos of the tower under construction? Are you aware of any?
If I have not seen any, which amazes me. All I've found, the documentation that I've found is a price list, a kind of a list of all the costs. So he made records of, what the electrician got, what the plumber got, all of that. We have some drawings done after the fact, architectural drawings that were done of the silo, but that was, after it was built. And I think Bob Bascom commissioned those. But it just amazes me. There's so little documentation of it.
I'm seeing another question here from Peter Howell. Do you know who or what inspired Esherick's interest in concrete construction?
Probably Lou Kahn. So that workshop building we were talking about, that was a collaboration between Wharton Esherick, Lou Kahn, and Ann Ting. So Lou Kahn was an architect, Ann Ting was an architect working in his office. And the two of them had collaborated on other concrete block structures. I mean, Lou Kahn is associated with brutalism, and the brute in brutalism actually means raw, and it refers to the use of raw concrete, raw wood, kind of exposed materials. So of course, Wharton Esherick being Wharton Esherick, paints the workshop that he builds with Lou Kahn blue and salmon colored, because he's not into brutalism that way. He's a lot more kind of warm, kind of personable. I think of his buildings as very extroverted. But he would have, from Kahn, if he didn't get that kind of purist love of, plain concrete with light, filtering subtly over it, he did see definitely the uses of that material.
Can I ask I'm really excited about this. Can I ask a question also?
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about, is there a relationship between Rudolf Steiner's buildings too? I don't actually know how those are constructed, but I think of the curves in those.
Yeah, so Rudolf Steiner was an architect. He was Austrian. He's well known for his association with anthroposophy. And anthroposophical design and architecture is very expressionistic. It also has lots of organic forms, and many people, notably, I think Mark Safiri has associated Wharton Esherick's early furniture making with anthroposophical design. Certainly I think that was an influence on him. So Rudolf Steiner had created a building called the Guthianum, which was a very large theater with all of this wonderful carved wood interiors, and it burned to the ground right after it was completed. And he started right away with a new cast concrete version of it. Well, actually, it was a totally different building, but a new cast concrete building. And he did get a lot of these really kind of wild organic forms in this cast concrete. So that's, yeah, it's a great, great connection there.
I'll have to take a trip and see the.
That's on my list. I really want to see that building. Yeah. And all the buildings around it too. Yeah.
I'm seeing also that Damon Manny is encouraging us to look in our kitchen cabinets to see if we can, if that tells us anything about how the silo was constructed. And I see that our preservation director, Andy Gustine, is on the call too. So
yeah.
we might see if when Andy looks in the cupboards, he can learn anything.
Yeah. I will say that I went down, there's kind of a basement to the silo that is kind of an electrical room. And I did go down there before this presentation to see if I could see any of the blocker, because I'm also very curious how you would take, these rectangular blocks and make a kind of organic curved building. How would you fill in between where the gaps were? But it was all very finished. It was much more finished than I expected. Yeah, we'll take a peek in those cabinets and see if there's any unfinished spaces we can get a look at.
Hey, Holly.
Hey.
Hi, Katie. Sorry, I was having trouble getting myself, unmuted, etc. But I did hear the talk about the concrete block.
Yeah.
And it is actually very simple. As long as you're not trying to make too tight of a curve, the blocks can be, they can be cut into different, to kind of create a faceted curve. And then that faceted curve, when it's covered with stucco, the stucco finishes off the smoothness of the curve. So I don't think a building like the silo and similar to the workshop, the curves in the workshop walls are very minimal, almost hard to see without looking for them. But I'm pretty sure the silo, it's all conjecture, because as you said, we have no photographs, no real evidence. But to my eye, it would not be that difficult for the masons to have created that curve just with concrete block and then the stucco applied over it. So
oh, thank you.
my 2 cents.
Yeah.
Cutting the blocks. That's what you have to think of that next.
Uh-huh.
As soon as you say that, you go, oh, sure. That makes sense.
By that
Thank
time,
you.
they probably
Yeah.
even had, had nice diamond blade concrete saws. I mean, it's a pretty, at that date, we're kind of in the modern era.
Mhm.
So
So Andy, I'll just ask, do you think these would have been solid blocks or would they have been hollow?
that could be either. Hollow is the most common because it's lighter, easier to work with. But we don't know. Yeah, we don't really know. I mean, I would love to cut a hole and all the, in the workshop and in the studio. I mean,
Yeah.
I wouldn't really want to do that, but I mean, just for the sake of knowing, it would be interesting.
Yeah, I had high hopes for the electrical closet, but it was all finished off.
Yeah. We'll see if the coordination with the University of Pennsylvania and some of their preservation program, maybe we're hoping to get some coursework that focuses on some testing around the silo. And I know in there was even something like, some kind of penetrating radar. So who knows, we might be able to,
Yeah.
X-ray the walls in some fashion.
Yeah.
But yeah, for now, it's all conjecture. But conjecture is fun.
Yeah.
Thank you for chiming in, Andy.
Sure.
Were there any other questions or comments before we wrap up? Well, if not, thank you, Holly, for such a wonderful talk, and thank you all for the questions and the conversation. And we'll send around a follow-up email after to link you to the recording and any other resources that might be relevant. And hopefully we'll see you at the next Spotlight Talk on November 15th, which is going to highlight some of the loans from the Fabric Workshop Museum that are currently on view in the studio, and we'll kind of highlight some of the connections to Esherick contemporaries that we're spotlighting there. So thanks so much for joining us, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you.
It's
Well
great to
done.
see you again. Bye.